The Tiny House Movement and the American Dream. Episode 2, the Tiny House Theory series. This series examines the tiny house, not as a trend, but as a historical and political structure. These videos investigate housing, labor, debt, architecture, colonialism, sustainability, mobility, gender, and survival through the cultural figure of the tiny house. In this video, the tiny house movement is examined through the history of the American dream and changing meaning of ownership, home ownership in the United States. The tiny house movement is often presented as a rejection of mainstream housing culture. It is framed as an escape from consumerism, suburban excess, debt, and environmental destruction. But the relationship between tiny houses and the American dream is more complicated than simple rejection. Tiny houses did not emerge outside American housing ideology. In many ways, they reorganized it into a smaller and more precarious form. To understand why tiny houses became culturally positive, powerful, it is necessary to examine the historical meaning of home ownership itself. The American dream has never been only about shelter. It has also been about citizenship, morality, labor, property, family, independence, stability, and status. The home became a symbol of personal success and social legitimacy. This connection intensified after the Second World War. Mass suburban expansion transformed home ownership into a central political and economic project in the United States. Government-backed mortgages, highway systems, zoning laws, and large-scale suburban construction encouraged millions of Americans to pursue detached single-family homes. The suburban house became tied to the image of the stable citizen. Ownership signaled discipline. Mortgage repayment signaled responsibility. Domestic stability signaled moral success. But this system was never universally accessible. Post-war homeownership in the United States was deeply racialized and classed. Federal housing policies disproportionately benefited white middle-class families while excluding many Black Americans and other marginalized groups through redlining, discriminatory lending practices, and segregated development patterns. The American dream functioned unevenly from the beginning. At the same time, suburban expansion reshaped the relationship between labor and housing. At the same time, suburban expansion reshaped the relationship between labor and housing. Sorry. Mortgages increasingly required decades of continuous wage labor. The 30-year mortgage became normalized as a structure organizing adult life itself. Employment decisions, family planning, geographic mobility, and psychological stress became connected to debt repayment. Housing became inseparable from labor discipline. This relationship intensified during the late 20th century as housing prices rose and economic inequality expanded. Homeownership remained culturally idealized even as it became materially unstable for many people. Then came the 2008 financial collapse. The housing crisis destabilized public confidence in the traditional promises associated with ownership and mortgage security. Millions of people experienced foreclosure, unemployment, debt expansion, or severe economic uncertainty. The crisis exposed the fragility of systems that had long been presented as stable. Megan Carrar's situates the rise of the tiny house movement directly within this post-recession environment. She argues that tiny houses emerged during a period of growing housing insecurity and neoliberal restructuring in which individuals were increasingly expected to solve structural economic problems through personal adaptation. This context matters enormously. Tiny houses did not emerge during economic optimism, they emerged during economic contraction. The emotional appeal of tiny houses after 2008 reflected widespread exhaustion with debt-based domestic life. Smaller homes promised reduced mortgages, lower utility costs, fewer possessions, increased mobility, simplified living. But they also reflected shrinking expectations. The dream itself became compressed. Instead of the large suburban home, the ideal became the efficient small dwelling. Instead of upward expansion, there was strategic reduction. Instead of abundance, there was controlled minimalism. This transformation did not necessarily reject ownership ideology. In many cases, it preserved ownership as an ideal while reducing its scale. The tiny house still promised autonomy, control, privacy, domestic independence, personal property. The structure became smaller, but the ideological framework often remained intact. This is one reason the movement is difficult to classify politically. Tiny houses can appear anti-capitalist because they critique excess consumption and mortgage dependency. At the same time, they often reinforce highly individualized solutions to structural problems. Rather than demanding large-scale housing reform, the movement frequently emphasizes personal lifestyle adjustment. This reflects broader neoliberal logic. Under neoliberal systems, social crises are often reframed as matters of individual management. Housing insecurity becomes a personal budgeting issue. Environmental collapse becomes ethical consumption. Economic instability becomes minimalist self-discipline. The individual is expected to adapt continuously to unstable conditions. The tiny house fits neatly within this framework because it transforms structural pressure into aesthetic choice. This does not mean that everyone involved in the movement consciously supports neoliberal ideology. Many people enter tiny housing out of genuine necessity, ecological concern, or exhaustion with debt structures. But movements can still reflect larger political conditions, even when participants interpret them differently. This contradiction appears throughout tiny house culture. Taylor Pierce argues that the movement contains tension Sorry. Between grassroots anti-consumerist ideals and increasingly commodified forms of housing production. Tiny houses are often marketed through luxury finishes, architectural branding, curated interiors, social media aesthetics, high-end customization. Simplicity itself becomes marketable. Minimalism becomes a commodity. The movement therefore exists in an unstable position between resistance and adaptation. At the same time, the tiny house also functions psychologically. After periods of economic instability, people often seek forms of life that appear manageable and controllable. Tiny houses visually promise containment during periods of uncertainty. The small dwelling appears understandable, efficient, organized, financially survivable. This emotional dimension helps explain why tiny house media became so widespread after the recession. Most viewers will never live in a tiny house, but many consume the image of tiny housing repeatedly through YouTube, HGTV, Instagram, Airbnb culture, architectural blogs. The tiny house becomes a fantasy of reduced pressure. This fantasy is historically important, even when materially unrealistic. Ford and Gomez-Lanier note that the movement has frequently been framed as a sustainable and affordable alternative to conventional housing. But affordability itself has become unstable inside the movement. As demand increased, many tiny houses became expensive custom-built products. Some cost as much as a traditional homes in certain regions, once land, infrastructure, transportation, and utilities are included. Again, the contradiction remains central. The movement critiques housing systems while participating in housing markets. It critiques consumption while generating new forms of consumption. It critiques suburban excess while preserving the cultural importance of ownership. This complexity is precisely why the tiny house movement matters historically. It reveals how the American dream changed after economic crisis. The dream did not disappear, it contracted. The large suburban house became increasingly unattainable for many people, but the desire for private domestic autonomy, it remained powerful. The tiny house reorganized that desire into a smaller architectural form. If the suburban home represented post-war optimism and expansion, the tiny house reflects an era shaped by debt anxiety, ecological fear, housing insecurity, and economic contraction. The movement therefore reveals not only changing architecture, but changing expectations about survival itself. If this video has examined the relationship between tiny houses and the American dream of ownership, the next video examines one of the movement's deepest intellectual ancestors, Henry David Thoreau, and the long history of simplicity culture in the United States.